One of the big issues and challenges facing the participation of women in the workforce is the gender gap in the labor force. Now, this is an issue all over the world, became worse during the pandemic because when jobs were lost, women suffered more than their male counterparts. But there seems to be some good news. Now, according to a report from Moody's, which says, titled Narrowing the Gender Participation Gap, released recently, this space, this difference between the number of men and women in the workforce is reducing. And definitely India has contributed positively. Now, that's an interesting angle because the gap between the number of men and women in India and the participation of women in the Indian labor force has been an endemic issue. Are we seeing this improving, and is the pace good enough? To speak more on this, I'm joined now by Holland. She's Director of Economic Research at Moody's. Dawn, thank you so much for speaking with us here at NDTV Profit. Absolute pleasure to chat with you. Let's begin by just breaking down this report and what, in your view, is the big takeaway. And this is the way I saw it, at least, that the gap is narrowing. That's good news. From an Indian perspective, still a long way to go, but there has been some improvement. Would that be the right way to see it?
I think you sort of covered it in a nutshell. So the key finding of our report was that since the pandemic, gender gaps in labor force participation had been narrowing across the world. And what was particularly surprising to discover is how really global in nature this phenomenon is. We're seeing it in India, but also, in the US, in Japan, in Turkey, Argentina, Indonesia, Europe. It's truly a global phenomenon with more and more women joining or rejoining the workforce and doing so at a faster pace than men, which is helping to narrow gender gaps in labor force participation. So our sort of key outcome from our modeling work on this was to estimate that the narrowing of gender gaps in labor force participation around the world since 2019 has added about $1.5 trillion to the world economy. And we see a big chunk of that actually coming out of India.
All right. So that's the interesting thing. When you say a big chunk coming out of India, can we quantify it, and what has changed? Now, your report also alludes to this, and we have seen this anecdotally. Work from home, especially in sectors where it could be done, has changed the scene for women who want to come in and participate in the workforce, isn't it? Has that been a big difference?
I think you hit the nail on the head. Absolutely. That's one of the very key factors that we see as driving this change, this resurgence in female labor force participation rates. There's been a step change in attitudes towards working from home across the world. You see that it's happening in India, but also happening all over the world. And that has opened doors and created opportunities for many women in particular who may have been juggling family, childcare, elderly care responsibilities, and finding it difficult to engage with the labor market if they were required to do a full day of work in an office setting outside of the home. So this has been a really key force that has helped to bring loads of women into the workforce. And we've also seen it's not just allowing people to engage more, but it's also allowed more women to move from sort of part-time positions to full-time positions, particularly in some of the higher wage sectors, which means we're creating not just more jobs, but better quality jobs for women as well.
So just coming back to the female labor force participation rate in India, government data from October 2023 pegs it at 37%. Which is higher, significantly higher than earlier, 4% higher. The aim, of course, is to reach to 50%. Do you see these trends being underlined from your research and data? Where do you think the change is, and how far do we need to go?
So I think so that's aligned very, very closely with the sort of data that we've been working with from international organizations. Yes, so we have seen a significant increase in female labor force participation rates over the last few years in India. We do know, of course, that the gender gaps in India are still very wide, among the highest in the world. So let's not be under any illusion that we've solved the problem yet. But there has been some significant progress on that front. I think I would point perhaps to one important factor is that we've also, over the last decade or couple of decades, actually, seen significant narrowing of gender gaps in higher education in India. So that's been creating this sort of young cohort of highly educated women who are now just beginning to engage with the workforce, which I think sort of paves the way for us to continue to see more rapid progress in narrowing those gaps over the coming years.
So just two questions in the end, Dawn. One is, this is a great trajectory. Trend-wise, it's great. Can it sustain? Because base rates also come into play. This is also post-pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. So have things changed definitively that will ensure that this sustains? And will we now hopefully see also a narrowing in the wage gap now that at least participation has narrowed?
So the wage gap is a second story. So, all right, first question, is this a permanent shift? Or we may well see some backsliding. There has been a number of companies, the gap between the number of days that people want to work remotely and the number of days that employers want to offer to work remotely is still about one full day around the world. This is based on global studies, which means that there may be some backtracking in allowing employers allowing hybrid working, which could set things back a bit, which would be really disappointing. It would be great to see some legislation coming in that helped to support continued access for hybrid working where in industries where that it makes sense. In terms of the gender gaps in pay, this is, again, a global story. It is not exclusive to India. We see women and men working in exactly the same positions. Women tend to get paid 15 to 30% less than men for doing exactly the same jobs. This is a long-standing problem that is very difficult to shift. I think the key is transparency in pay scales. We see that companies that have clear salary bands that are attached to specific job roles, clear criteria for determining how each employee falls within those bands, have much narrower gaps in pay. So trying to encourage greater transparency, I think, is key in this area.
All right, so more work to do there. The good news is more women are now coming back into the workforce. So that difference between the number of men and women is reducing. The next step, of course, hopefully, is that they will get paid more equitably. Thank you so much, Dawn, for speaking with us today.
Thank you.